Welcome back, everyone. We are on the third and final lecture for today, which is lecture 15, simply called Recent Photography and Advertising. Um, and of course, these pertain to our course topic. The first focus is going to be on Chris Jordan's photographs that are quite famous, that came out about 15 years ago. And I'm sure many of you have seen them. If you haven't, you'll see how shocking they are. Perhaps we can show those just to begin with, those three. Yeah. So that's one. There's just three photos. Um, there's one, and then you scroll down. Can you see that? These are dead albatrosses on a Pacific island, different Pacific islands. One is the island of Midway, as it's called, and with plastic in their gut, which has killed them. And then the final image is actually Chris Jordan himself photographing live albatrosses, but also dead ones. And so perhaps we could just leave it on. Yeah, I think that's good enough. Do you need to see those again? Did you see? Maybe look at that. I guess maybe one thing I should note, because I'm going to mention this, but just to keep in our mind, is these are the products that humans throw away on an everyday basis. These are not unusual products. They're bottle caps, and so on. And so thanks, Ankita. Yeah. So keeping these images in mind, we want to ask, perhaps think about why they had such a big effect. It surprised Chris Jordan himself. And I should say that the reason, obviously, they died from this is they thought that the color, they're attuned to color-coded food, that these plastics were food. And even the mothers sometimes were feeding plastic to the albatrosses. So many years ago in 1967, to set up this sort of idea of, again, spectacle and visual rhetoric, the French philosopher Guy Debord famously published Society of the Spectacle. There was actually a similar book, not by a philosopher, by a historian a few years before that, on the power of the image. But that's another book. But anyway, he argued that in modern societies, quote unquote, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that has directly lived has moved away into a representation. Now, he said this in 1967, right? I think he had not been to Las Vegas yet, or places where spectacle and what the idea of putting on a facade that I think we are all savvy about, more or less, today. Doesn't mean we don't get sucked into it, but we are knowledgeable about this. Among many thought-provoking statements, he also writes, the spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. So the argument is that then the relations between people become corrupted. Now, it's interesting to think of this in light of social media today, which has also been accused of, rightly so, I think, of alienating ourselves from social interaction. And it's not just social media. It could be addiction to video games. In Japan and South Korea, occasionally, someone will die by not leaving their room, addicted to a video. It's a matter of addiction, the addictive part of the brain, not leaving the room and not eating or eating junk food, and then there's a name, in fact, in Japanese apparently for this. But the point is that we have reached this degree that perhaps Guy Debord hadn't foreseen. But nonetheless, it's interesting to think about because as we look at Chris Jordan's images, we have to ask ourselves, on one hand, they are spectacle, right? But on the other hand, they have alerted a lot of people to this drastic problem. Even earlier in 1935, as some of you know, Walter Benjamin, the German Jewish critic of media, student of media, had lamented the fact that in film, both still and moving film, the representation of original paintings, for example, he argued, had lost its aura, the aura of original presence. However, his being partly a Marxist, he thought this was the cost, the necessary cost of then disseminating these images to everyone. Not everyone can go see the original. Now, debatable what that aura means. That's almost a religious effect. And in fact, some people have seen, he was a secular Jew, but some people have seen this as in the tradition of what is called biblical exegesis, or the interpretation of all the metaphors and things, theological interpretations applied in a secular way. That's interesting to think about. But anyway, if there's this aura, he said, well, you can mass print the Mona Lisa images and then everyone can enjoy it, right? And so this has been it's an easy to read, it's a very accessible article, and it's still studied a lot. In a sense, both Debord and Benjamin could be viewed as hanging on to a Platonic ideal of original presence, the very assumption that Derrida would critique around the same time as Debord's book appeared, about a year later. Later still, the British art critic and writer John Berger echoed Benjamin's argument in his influential 1972 book, Ways of Seeing, which is also used a lot in teaching because, again, it's very accessible. And he was an art critic and a novelist, but he also talks about media. He argued that modern media had ruined the aesthetic and political significance of art. And there's an argument to be made there. On the other hand, media itself can, if used wisely or appropriately, can be art. What is media? It's all tools. These are all human inventions. I think what they mean, though, is sort of the mass use of media without any reflection, right? Unreflexive. It's just consumed. The Canadian media critic Marshall McLuhan drew on such theories in phrasing his famous 1970s slogan about media, "The medium is the message." So these are just some of the important figures. There's a department of communication, media, and persuasion next door to me in my institution, and they do deal with this a lot, right? Although they're not film critics, right? They are looking purely at the mass production of images. Their insights have informed a great deal of film theory, and it's interesting to think about how those enter into our course topic of post-colonial eco-criticism. If what media critics argue is valid, we could, for example, say that all the photographs and films we categorize as being environmentally friendly should ideally alert us to this social relation, even as they themselves are mediating images according to their representational capabilities. So even if, like Chris Jordan, his images, right? It's not that they are still part of a sort of overall web of what we might call the semiotics of the spectacle. But it doesn't mean but they are still more powerful. So I think that's what we have to think about. Now, this is more of an eco-critical perspective. It's not specifically post-colonial. However, if you bring animal studies into it, it's the idea of humans dominating the animal kingdom in such a way that we are, of course, animal critics would be the first to say that we are non-human animals. But nonetheless, it's a way of saying how our species has dominated the species to the extent that we are eliminating them. Now, arguably, as Elizabeth Kolbert has argued, we are in the sixth extinction. So the five great extinctions in human geological, not human, in geological and very late, very, very late, tiny bit into the human. So the Pleistocene being, the last. Are we in the Anthropocene? Perhaps. But on top of that, perhaps we're in the mass extinction, and it may be well be because so many species are dying out. It's really tragic. Footnote: uh, they are. There's talk of reviving certain species, right? Like the Tasmanian tigers by DNA. So they have the last Tasmanian tiger from 100 years ago. They've been freezing it or frozen it since. So in Australia they're going to try to bring this back. But then you still have to implant that DNA into another close relative. But this has already been done in a sense with American bison. If you ever go to Yellowstone Park, which is not just a 3-hour drive from where I am, you can see wild bison. But these are slightly smaller. They're about 80% of the size of the original American bison that roamed the American plains in tens of millions. And the first, even in the up until about 1850-ish, if I'm not mistaken, there are reports of settlers coming in there and saying, as far as the eye could see were the buffalo. Now, the Native Americans had lived with the buffalo for centuries. By 1900, only about 100,000 remained. That's how fast the people shot them for sport. Now, that's a graphic example. But then at least they have tried to preserve them by crossbreeding and so forth. And they are wild, but are they not the same as the past? Secondly, there's efforts to rewild places, right? And remember I mentioned the wolves coming into Yellowstone? So that's one. But there's also a rewilding where they're going to they have, or maybe now, reintroduced wolves in some European forests where they've been absent for a couple hundred years. There's also a different kind of rewilding where they may want to, some Russian guy wants to recreate the mammoth, but that has to be crossbred with an elephant. All of which is to say that we humans are great at manipulating the environment and the animal kingdom, even if you first eradicate them and then you want to bring them back. Now, what does this have to do with media? Well, arguably, if used like Chris Jordan, his photos, it can be an impetus. It can stir up. He got mail from everywhere in the world. He was blown away. And arguably, it had to happen in this information period, right? After the internet. Maybe that's one reason. So that's the paradox. You had to use this technology that uses so much energy that arguably everything is interconnected, and there's a kind of ripple effect that happens that displaces these animals, but then allows us now to communicate. I'm not talking loud enough. To communicate that threat and those extinctions. So someone could say, well, maybe if we are in the age of the spectacle, the other thing one could argue perhaps is that, well, we cannot capture any actual presence of animals, right? It's all kind of mediated. But then someone might say, what do you mean by authentic presence, right? So we have these kind of philosophical circles. Bottom line, it seems to me, if we can stop the extinction and the death of animals like this, then that's good. Chris Jordan's iconic photographs jolt us into considering also something else, which is that synthetic products of the modern world, plastics especially, often end up inside the animal world. And more recently, as we know, we have microplastics in us, and as I said the other day, gets us back to this argument of Donna Haraway that we are cyborgs. uh, it's a thought experiment at the very least, and it makes you think about what it is that we mean by human. There's a great article that I'm drawing on, a 2023 article on the BBC Online, which reproduced, there are many articles on Chris Jordan's works, and he goes back to Midway once in a while. He's still photographing things. By the way, there are some wonderful photographers working whose photographs are considered art at the same time as they are raising our consciousness of Earth. And one guy goes and photographs old factories that have been abandoned, right, all over the world. Or another might be photographing, specializing in mining operations. So in the state next to where I live, Montana was infamous for a long time in mining, and there's a derelict mine, but it's become a tourist attraction. The artificial lake that is now a kind of weird color, even though the mine is defunct, that pollution has changed the color to this kind of weird topaz kind of color. I read recently, and I should have put it in here, about, this is happening in Africa, especially where rare earth metals are being mined. Of course, that's child labor in some cases, horrific conditions. But also, there's an artist in West Africa, I can't remember which country. Again, I'll have to look this up. And he goes and he sits on the edge of these polluted lakes and paints them, and he tries to use some of the water from the lake. So it's sort of like the medium is part of that. And it's fascinating, right, to think about how he's trying to document in his way. So there are many ways to do this. So when he first went to this atoll, Midway Atoll, this tiny islands tiny stretch of island in the middle of the Pacific in 2009, he had no idea, as I said, this would go viral. And this is what he said. He saw all these dead, birds with these toothbrushes and things in them. I immediately felt this magnetic pull to go, he says. He was determined to, quote, find a way to photograph these birds that honored the depth of this environmental tragedy. So he was conscious of what he was doing. He just had no idea people would watch all these. Now, actually, the first known photographs of plastic waste had been made as long ago as 1966 by U.S. researchers in the Pacific Islands. Plastic ingestion in albatross chicks causes fragments to puncture the gut wall or cause dehydration. Heavy metals and other chemicals can leach off in concentrations that may be lethal to the birds. So this was known, but nothing was done, right? When Jordan knew of while he knew of these previous photos, he attempted to bring a more emotional dimension to his images. He likens composing photographs of these dead birds to, quote, a grief ritual. This is what he says. I think it's very interesting. When we arrange sacred objects on an altar, there's a way that we naturally do it with a symmetry and balance, and we might spend a lot of time doing it until it all holds together. So he has this in mind. he chose to use a diffuser, a white material stretched across a frame that depresses bright light to create a softer glow. But he didn't arrange the animals. He didn't change that, which contributes to a feeling of a photograph that goes a little deeper, he says. That's the only thing he did. Oh, sorry. When he returned to Seattle, he thought he'd completed his project. I said goodbye to the island, went home, then processed the images and put them out there. So, as I said, he says so many people were writing a trauma response. They were like really moved. People wanted to go to Midway and save the albatrosses. But the plastic is not coming from this island. It's a systemic problem. And we know that there are these huge concentrations of plastic, right? They're like islands floating around the Pacific. A recent World Wildlife Fund projects that plastic production is expected to more than double by 2040, resulting in plastic debris in the ocean quadrupling by 2050. One environmental engineer says that she's a world expert on plastic pollution, Jenna Jambek, calculated that in 2010 alone, 8 million tons of plastic waste entered the ocean from sources on land, and that's, the British BBC says, the equivalent of 650,000 double-decker buses in 1 year. So he says that that many birds is amazing. Immediately, the other side of the story began to present itself, and the theme became the name of the island, to stand midway. The island is Midway, but he felt it was like to stand midway between horror and beauty. So there were these live albatrosses, and in fact, he sees one to make how he copes with it. He started to get to know one chick, and then he would come back the next year and see it growing. Between the hell of seeing our plastic in this viscerally awful way appearing inside the stomach of these baby birds and the paradise of this tropical island that is being lovingly stewarded and protected as a marine sanctuary, covered by millions of these beings that have no fear of humans. So that's the other thing, right? That's the irony. Slow violence. There's no fear of humans. And apparently I've had friends go to the Galapagos Islands. You can walk right up to all of the creatures, whether they're the monitor lizards that learn to swim, or the seals, or the birds. And we're not used to that, right? Where everything is fearless of humans, which is kind of scary, because if anyone were to come in with a malicious effort. So we saw the Planet of the Apes movie, this idea of invasion into paradise, right? But that invasion is something that we were talking earlier, that this is still very much the formula of a Hollywood film, right? But that is because it's as powerful as that could be if you read it as a slave capture. Nonetheless, it's something that is still visual and we can relate to. Here, it's very visual, but it's a different kind of invasion, right? It's the invasion of our residue, our waste, that is killing them. Maybe I think the contrast of the innocent birds not knowing, right, at all what is killing them, and not being able to recognize that they have to stop it. He also spent, if you're interested, I haven't watched this, he spent 4 years making a documentary called Albatross, released in 2018, and this is where he partly talks about taking care of this one albatross. There's also, in the same year, David Attenborough's film Blue Planet 2, and an award-winning film called A Plastic Ocean was produced. The producer of that film, Joe Ruxton, who founded something called Ocean Generation, included a sequence about the plastic threatening Midway's albatrosses in her film. She says what makes Jordan's photos resonate with people is that they recognize the things they've thrown away. So that you feel guilty. You can see little fragments of plastic in things as small as mussels, oysters, even zooplankton. But it's when you see things that we actually use, that's what makes people relate to them, right? They found things like a printer cartridge, a golf ball, cigarette lighters. There's also a new disease discovered in 2023 in seabirds caused by plastic ingestion, which really causes a cellular disease called plasticosis. They don't have any better word for it. That scars their digestive tracts and can lead to infection and parasites. Now, things are slowly improving in that regard, with regard to the helping some of these, relatively, with some of these use of plastic. I know some countries have, including some places in India, have stopped plastic bags and things. There's a global plastics treaty from last year. Of course, sometimes new governments disregard these. That's the problem. I'm coming to the end now. I'll just say that Jordan still feels that there's something missing, he says. He believes the heart of this crisis lies in society's disconnect between actions and impacts on the environment. And I think we can all say that, right? It's hard to make that connection. Obviously, some viewers have. But this has to translate to policy. Now, we are getting into the sort of the eco-critics do look at these kinds of things. They look at treaties. You can read treaties, right, as a text, just as you read photographs as a text, to try to make sense of how we react to these. For him, successfully tackling plastic pollution hinges on rebuilding a strong relationship with nature, of course. Easier said than done. That's where indigenous peoples can teach us a lot. He says, yeah, millions of people are waking up, but the weirdest thing is that the majority of people who are in power in our world are the most disconnected. So the more power you have, the more in a bubble you live, at least he says this, but he echoes what many people have said. But what's interesting is that he still talks about the grief that was so intense when he first encountered this. And he says, the reason I feel so much is because I love them, right? So he says that's what grief is, a direct felt experience of love for something we are losing and for something that is suffering. I felt liberated to fully feel it. That's a doorway. So perhaps we are in the arts, and we do deal with emotions, right? And aesthetics. And I think his photographs count for something in that way. Can you talk about a photograph like that in aesthetic terms? It's possible. But as long as you never lose sight of, what you're really talking about. I use the example in my classes. I know this is a pretty obvious example, perhaps, to my undergraduate first-year classes, I might say, why is art is not about escapism. Art is the opposite, right? To prompt us to think. So I always use the same example for 20 years, which is Pablo Picasso's Guernica painting, which I was lucky enough to see in the Prada, which is the painting of, is it in the Prada or was it in Barcelona? Anyway, it's the big painting he did of the bombing of a village in Spain during the Franco regime, 1936. He was actually asked by the government first to do he was living in Paris, hey, do a painting for the exposition representing Spain. He was so angry by this bombing, what Franco did was, he became the dictator. He asked his friend Adolf to send over his Luftwaffe, Adolf Hitler, and the German planes came and bombed a village of 10,000, flattened it, right? Men, women, and children. and animals. So if you look at that painting, it's got the animals. It's cubist, and it's great teaching. And then I say, is this beautiful? Art is not. I mean, there's a misconception in popular culture about art being, beautiful, and we frame it, but it's really should make us pause. I love what one art critic. Oh, there it is, Guernica. Merci beaucoup, or I should say, gracias. Um, this is you can see the light bulb, which is modern. It's a modern thing, but it's also the fragmentation of bodies, both human and animal. And the bull is, of course, a symbol of Spain itself. Um, and then you have the horse, and all in agony, right? And I think it's a brilliant painting. It's a big one, and so this abstract art. Of course, Franco then, when the regime saw the painting, they did not want it. So um, it was returned to Spain much later. So anyway, it's a great teaching tool. But the question, it's like Chris Jordan's images then, is to say, can it be aesthetic? Perhaps sometimes that could be a distraction. Maybe that's not the main point. I don't know. But certainly he wanted to put that filter on to soften, to have a certain lighting. Now, this is not the same as Courbet, but Courbet too was not changing a whole lot. So you can read these in different ways. If the impact, though, is to make people aware of conservation, I think that's great. So, I was thinking of I watched a really, that I just lost my train of thought. First of all, my brain works in weird ways because my gray cells are dying. But the Nicki Minaj, remember the first day I said the second day, the Creole? She's from Trinidad and Tobago. She's part Indian. You see how my brain, I thought I got to remember to say that. The other thing I wanted to say was I watched a silly film on Netflix recently, really bad. It's called Underneath Paris, or Under Paris, and it's about this giant shark. Yeah, yeah. And it's really odd because the young woman wants to, and that's noble, right? Normally, she wants to save the sharks, but she's naive. She's 19 or something. And to the point where she wants to swim and she gets eaten. Sorry, I spoiled the film for you, but on the one hand, it seems like it's got a conservation message, but on the other hand, it's sensationalist, right? It's all the sharks you don't really come to sympathize with the sharks at all. So I think it's just flip. It just doesn't do anything for the message, right? Another important footnote is that the film Jaws, 50 years ago, by Spielberg's first big budget film, still studied in film schools, and it's brilliant. But what it did was demonize sharks, based on Peter Benchley's novel of a couple of years before. What I read not a few years ago was that Peter Benchley, a few years after that, was so filled with remorse because he had started this demonization of sharks that he became a conservationist. So you have these weird, things where the power of images, right? Now, when Spielberg's doing this film, it's just filmmaking, how to grab the audience. He's very skilled, They don't think about this, but we still have that impulse and it's about marketing. Right? It's a critique of marketing because they don't want to close the beaches because they want to make money and all this stuff. So, same thing with in this film Under Paris. It's set just before the Olympics. They don't want to close the Seine River, right? Interestingly enough, that was in the news until just before the Olympics for being polluted. Greenwashing. Now we come to this idea of then, okay, we've got pollution, and this is probably more familiar, where companies try to portray themselves as environmentally friendly. Why do they do this? Because it sells. So there's something interesting about the public, mass public, wanting to be sensitive to the environment, but not too badly. You know, if it disrupts my lifestyle, I maybe not. So it's, but there's still some something there that, after all, these companies are spending millions to try to, instead of whitewash, to greenwash, right, their image. And now we have a couple more images, Ankita, those final images of greenwashing. So I actually just, you can go to the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is an American conservationist group. Um, there are many, many resources online for teaching these things. Sweetness from natural sources, and it's got a green label, Coca-Cola. Now, we know that Coca-Cola plants use up local water and the world over, and then want you to drink pure sugar. Um, and a lot of people will, as we know, drink for caffeine. But I'm not sure what's in this, and I haven't seen it myself. But the point is, it's greenwashing, right? So trying to sell yourself very cynically as sensitive to the environment, but it must be working to some degree. I don't know about it works for this product, but it works in general because these companies are doing that. The next image just below it is Ryanair, lowest fares, lowest emissions airline. Now everything's in green, right? The airplane is relatively small. It doesn't do anything. And to be honest, I love travel so much that I don't know if I could not use an airplane. Now, Greta Thunberg refuses. She did not. She came to all the way to the U.S., talked to Obama some years ago, did not use an airplane. She still had to find some mode of transportation, but she was trying to make a statement. So she never flies. That's pretty amazing, right? I don't think I could do that. But I do see, we do have to think about our conscious effort, presence in the world. So, and then I don't know if there was any others this is just a little thing. Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, it's pretty obvious how to spot greenwashing, and I can read a couple of these here. It rebrands itself. It makes the packaging green. So you can look at the value. If there's any writing on it, you can look at these. A lot of the claims are false. And you think, how can you get away with that legally? Well, there isn't much regulation on this because you can kind of, play the system to make it kind of nebulous about. They have their legal, councils, but somehow they make all kinds of crazy claims. So when British Petroleum, I don't know how many years ago, there was in the Gulf off of U.S., terrible oil spill. Yeah, and the fire and the underground, and it was horrific, and a lot of fisher people lost their livelihood. They're always now very green. After that, their ads are all about, at least on American television, we are working with the environment, and things like that. It's still a fossil fuel, so there's no way to really make that green. The question is, can any energy source be totally green? Probably not. So the question is now, what is the least harmful? So one thing interesting is these are effectively texts, right? You can read them. it's interesting to look at them and see, because these writers of advertising, think about how to do this, right? It's interesting if you go back and see how many poets and writers started out at writing ad. Uh, you know, Arun Kolatkar, Salman Rushdie. I mean, it just goes on and on. They didn't stay at that, but they were trying to make a living, and they knew how to use language. So some of these are pretty clever in doing that. So let me just read this parts of this. And again, I'm adapting from the Natural Resources Defense Council, right? But there are many, many resources online. How this works exactly in literature is not something I'm going to attempt, except to say that, as I said, you can read this as a text and make it contextual with, say, a novel that's talking about pollutants, or, right, you can show how this, there are a lot of novels that, for example, Zakes Mida's The Heart of Redness, which is a South African novel, talks about pollution, but it also has sort of the their indigenous. I don't know if he's not Zulu. Anyway, I can't remember, but his own African identity. He draws on some of the spiritual beliefs, but it's about modern South Africa and pollution of land. The Heart of Redness. So you could pair this with the greenwashing. There's also tourism a little bit in that novel, and we talked about Jamaica Kincaid's critique of tourism. Again, how tourist areas are greenwashed, right? You can have eco tourism, all right? So if you want to pay to go, you know, live with less carbon footprint and things like that. So in 2009, Volkswagen launched a wide-reaching marketing campaign to promote its clean diesel cars. Across print and televised ads, including one, the automaker touted a drastic reduction in the tailpipe emissions of its new VW and Audi models. And the slogan was, for the Audi commercial, somewhat the voiceover is, "Green has never felt so right." But a few years later, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is probably going to be demolished, discovered that Volkswagen had installed software allowing it to cheat emissions tests for 11 million of its vehicles, discovered by postgraduate students. Huge lawsuit. The automaker's so-called clean diesel cars actually produce nitrogen oxide emissions up to 40 times the legal limit. The resulting Dieselgate scandal marked one of the most notorious examples to date of deceptive environmental marketing, a phenomenon, as we know, greenwashing, and it cost Volkswagen nearly $40 billion. Since then, they have tried to make amends. But greenwashing is often far less sensational and hard to spot. Let's be honest, right? We encounter it so often. It's an act of making false or misleading claims, but again, it's very hard to, for a lot of these, some of the claims are, I don't know how they do it, but for some reason, they're not easy to prosecute. It was actually coined in 1986. I didn't know that, the greenwashing, in an essay by an environmentalist named Jay Westerveld. So while visiting a hotel in Fiji, he noticed that it asked guests to reuse towels for the planet's sake. Have you seen this, right? Yeah. Which I think is good. If you don't need to clean your towel, don't put it out. A request that would also conveniently save the hotel money. Fine. Meanwhile, the hotel, located near sensitive island ecosystems, was in the middle of an expansion. So, on the one hand, it's asking you, saying that you can contribute to the environment, but it's really helping these hotels save money. Okay, so that was the term was coined then. That's the main reason to mention that. But we do have a lot of fossil fuel. British Petroleum coined the term carbon footprint. I don't know. I hadn't known that. It's actually British Petroleum who did that when it launched a calculator for individuals to assess their personal emissions. It's become much more sophisticated, though. Nature-based imagery, like with trees, animals, on product packaging and in advertisements, can imply sustainability even if the company or product either actively harms the environment or takes no real steps to protect it. So, the question is, how do we change that? That's one thing. So this is a large, as I said, this becomes a more activist part of eco-criticism. So remember how I mentioned at the beginning of this talk week that the debate within post-colonialism of even Tagore was accused, not even post-colonialism, Tagore was accused of not being politically engaged. In the same way you might, you still see these criticisms of writers and films as not being complacent. In the same way, I think we have to ask ourselves. I mean, that's why eco-criticism, sometimes emphasizes the need to be activist. So if you go to the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, ASLE, there'll be ways of some resources for doing this. And a lot of the members are quite active in their local communities, right? So, for example, volunteering I have friends who volunteer to keep the trails clear in the mountains for hiking, or they may, make people aware of recycling. And by the way, recycling, we do the recycling in the U.S., but apparently it only contributes about 4% of helping, but that's something, I suppose. So, on a larger scale, there's this activist part of it, and some people, and it's up to you how you view that. Some people say, "What? Why should I be pressured to be activist about this or that?" The other side of it, though, is that how do we read into some literary works or films or whatever? Can we read into them a sort of activism? And there are some that are that way. Indra Sinha, Animals People, he started a kind of fund, I don't know if it was an NGO, but anyways, a fund to raise awareness and help the victims of Bhopal. So he was already active in that before he wrote the novel. But that doesn't mean that everyone has to be. And then, as I've said, the other way is to read these as texts themselves, as a context. Environmental buzzwords have no legal weight. Natural, eco-friendly, there's no way to prove that, so these companies can use them all they want. And it's intentionally vague. You can't pin them down. By the way, a lot of bottled water touts itself as coming from the springs, mountain springs and all, and it's not. There was one that was traced back to an ordinary neighborhood in Los Angeles, and they were bottling it as coming from pure streams, and so ridiculous. So be skeptical of greenwashing tied to sectors known for their environmentally harmful practices, such as, of course, fossil fuel companies, but logging, right? Anything that makes paper. It's not that these are evil. We're all complicit. It's just that we're trying to say, don't be deceitful, right? Products that lean on official-looking labels. Companies that produce plastic products often try to assuage consumer guilt by featuring a recycling symbol, right? And it doesn't really force the manufacturer to do much about this. Oh, here's the statistics. Sorry. As it stands, the world continues to recycle a meager 9% of the 400, this is written 2023, a meager 9% of the 440 million US tons of plastic waste produced each year. A couple of examples as we come to the end here. When the mining company, particular mining company, I had never heard of, but anyway, they were building a massive underground storage facility in a Chicago neighborhood in the city of Chicago. So it touted the possibility that its mining project would eventually house green businesses like solar panels or vertical gardens. However, this one investigative person named Gina Ramirez knew that it would more likely become a place for toxic industry. So they said, okay, we're going to plant trees. That's a common thing, right? And they even put an environmental activist on its staff, and they built a community center. But when it came to discussing the mine, which is their business, they failed to provide studies on the expected impact to air quality. So again, one way to notice this is that they're trying to distract people from what they're actually doing. So again, green sells. Companies that tout carbon offsets is a problem. The problem with carbon offsets is that they can buy these offsets, and is that there isn't enough land available to allow everyone that plans to rely on them to do so. So if everyone were relying on the land available on the planet, that wouldn't happen. Secondly, disasters happen, right? You could say, oh, we've conserved this forest, but then there's a wildfire. There are also well-intentioned sustainability practices that don't live up to their promise due to poor management and so forth. So greenwashing gives some companies an unfair advantage, but it's worth noting that there's also an environmental justice factor issue, and we've talked about this, where the places that have industrial pollution among human areas, settlements, tend to be the poorer areas. So that's the environmental justice, and really sometimes these commodities are being sold to people who can afford them, not to the poorer communities. So the poorer communities this is sort of general around the world. They bear the brunt of these commodities, of the pollution from these commodities, and they're not the intended target of the greenwashing. It's middle classes and upper classes. I think that's almost to the end here. So there's a lot more to be done, and I'm not sure, again, how I wanted to mention greenwashing because, again, it's so prevalent in our society that I think, are equipped as people who study language and literature and sign systems are equipped to critique. And that's why you'll see eco-criticism talk about this a lot. And so I think we can pair that. We can talk about it in our classes in conjunction with the literary artifacts that we're producing. Thank you, everyone.